Mrs. Riley was sitting in a chair gazing out the window at the passing clouds. She was a short woman with deeply wrinkled skin that spoke of her long and full life. Her brown, clear eyes still sparkled with life. Mrs. Riley's grey hair was neatly styled in curls. "Why isn't Simon calling?" she said quietly, reaching out for the phone. Her movements were slow and careful, as if she feared breaking it. It was her birthday today, but her only son hadn't rushed to congratulate her. "Maybe later," Mrs. Riley sighed, accustomed to the fact that her son was too busy with his own life to pay attention to her. "Well, that's enough. I am not going to mope any more," she exclaimed. This day was truly special. She was turning 80 years old. On such an anniversary, it was literally a crime to give in to despondency and sadness. Despite her advanced age and recent illness, Mrs. Riley got up from her chair decisively and made her way to the kitchen, holding onto the wall for support. Walking was difficult due to the stiffness in her joints, but fueled by the anticipation of the feast, Mrs. Riley briefly felt a surge of vigour and energy. She decided to cook an apple pie, which was one of her son's favourite desserts. Soon the appetising aromas filled the house, and then Mrs. Riley began to set the table. The beautiful tablecloth took its place, and the silverware emerged from a hidden drawer. Outside the window, the weather was grey, but the rooms of the almost empty house were filled with comfort and warmth. Most of the treats were for her son Simon, who lived not far away in the same town. However, he didn't often find the time to visit his elderly mother. Suddenly there was the sound of the front door opening. "Hello, are you home?" "Of course. Where would you go?" Simon called out and breathed in the aroma of the freshly cooked food with pleasure. Memories of his childhood in this house flooded back, making him slightly ashamed of his neglect, but only slightly. "Hello, Sonny," Mrs. Riley said as she stepped out of the kitchen into the hallway. She tossed aside the towel she was using to wipe her hands and embraced her son. He awkwardly patted her on the back and then disentangled himself from the embrace, handing his mother a bouquet of flowers. "How are you doing?" Simon muttered, taking off his jacket. "Oh, I'm getting along," his mother replied, relieved that her closest person had not forgotten about her special day after all. Mrs. Riley had so much to tell him and listened to stories about his life, but Simon hurried to the kitchen, not paying much attention to her. "That's right, you must be tired from the journey and hungry," Mrs. Riley said, unable to look at her only child objectively. And Simon grew accustomed to his mother's nurturing and pampering. She paid for his expensive education, bought him cars, and provided him with money whenever he asked. Perhaps she hoped to receive his love in return, but eventually she raised a narcissistic and idle individual. He never accomplished anything in life, although he was already 40 years old. Simon was a real disappointment, but not to his mother. "Come in, dear, the food is hot and fresh, just the way you like it," Mrs. Riley cooed, following behind her son. "Oh, a whole feast." The man skeptically shook his head as he sat down at the table. He had no idea how much effort it took for the 80-year-old woman to prepare the simple appetizers. Despite everything, Mrs. Riley felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her son's visit. She was certain that Simon was simply hiding his feelings, as is typical of boys, and deep down she hoped that he appreciated her life experience and wisdom. "Sonny, taste your favourite pie," she smiled, putting her arm around her long-awaited guest's shoulders. "Sure, I'll try it," Simon grumbled. Mrs. Riley ignored his displeasure and sat down on a chair next to him, mesmerised as she watched her son handle the fork. It had been a long time since she had seen someone eat her cooking with such enthusiasm. "So, is it good?" she asked. "Uh-huh." Every moment he spent with her felt precious to her. "How are you doing? Is everything all right?" she asked. Simon stood still for a moment, looking at his mother, as if trying to understand why she was asking. Not seeing any ulterior motive on her loving face, he simply shrugged. "Everything's fine, as usual," Simon continued chewing, "although some extra money wouldn't hurt." The undercurrent of hope in her son's voice made the woman uncomfortable, especially since she had already sent him a substantial sum not long ago. "Yes, indeed. Some extra money wouldn't hurt me either. The entire pension is spent on maintaining the house." The mother shook her head. Money had not always been a problem. Mrs. Riley was once known as a powerful and determined woman. She excelled in her career, holding management positions in many companies in the city. Her decision-making abilities, perseverance, and sociability made her a respected woman in town. "I'm amazed by your assertiveness. Not many women reach such heights," the mayor once told her at a social event. "There is nothing more valuable than success, right?" she replied then. But time spared no one. As the years went by, Mrs. Riley felt the need to take a break from the endless race for first place. She eventually decided to step down from leadership positions and devote herself to rest. However, by that time, her family had changed significantly. The son had long ago started living on his own, and her husband seemed to have forgotten about their shared happiness, and then he died altogether. "Did you visit Dad at the cemetery?" Mrs. Riley suddenly asked. Simon coughed, almost choking on another piece of pie. He grabbed the mug of juice, trying to ease the lump in his throat. "Mum, who thinks about a cemetery at a birthday party?" "Sorry," she sighed. The sudden loss of her husband 15 years ago was a serious blow for Mrs. Riley. She was left alone without her beloved partner. Pain and emptiness filled her heart, contributing to her withdrawal from social life. She preferred to spend her days in the solitude of her home, and only in her son's presence she found solace and the only spark of happiness. "By the way, it's good you mentioned the house," Simon said, coughing. Mrs. Riley looked at him in surprise, and only now did she notice a smug expression and a mischievous light in his eyes. She knew her son very well. Simon only acted this way when he expected to profit from something. But what kind of profit could he be talking about now? However, Mrs. Riley dismissed her suspicions, afraid of shattering the illusion of happiness that she had carefully built over the years. She simply smiled warmly, gazing happily at her son. Meanwhile, Simon rose from the table and began to inspect the kitchen meticulously. "Is this natural stone?" He nodded at the tiles. "Of course, we picked out the best one with my father," nodded his mother. "Good." Simon stretched out, taking a notebook out of his pocket. He walked out from behind the table, starting to walk around the room with an increasingly interested face. He examined every cabinet, scrutinized the walls, then moved quickly into the hallway, measuring doorways with a tape measure and taking measurements of the furniture in rooms. "That couch, the leather one, right?" he asked with visible greed in his voice. "Of course," Mrs. Riley answered automatically. "Great. How much is it?" "I don't remember. Why are you asking?" she said, but her question remained unanswered. Simon wrote down everything he discovered in his notebook. It was as if the man strove to create a complete representation of the dwelling without omitting a single detail. "What are you up to?" Mrs. Riley asked worriedly. "Just checking," waved Simon away and continued his journey through the house, taking notes, exploring every corner of it. The notebook was getting more and more filled, and the man was getting happier, as if he'd discovered a real treasure trove. "Do you want to renovate the house?" Mrs. Riley asked. "I don't need to." The house was in excellent condition. She and her husband had spent a lot of money when they were young to make it beautiful, and now all that was left was to maintain it. "You know, Mum, there's a thing," the son finally deigned to answer. He hesitated a bit, as if not knowing how to approach the most important question, but Mrs. Riley knew her offspring too well to understand without words. "Are you in trouble?" she asked in a drooping voice. "Not really in trouble, just temporary difficulties." Simon smiled awkwardly. "I'm in a bit of debt, so I promised to sell the house and pay everything." "But how could you, son? It's our memory, and where am I supposed to live? Will you take me to you?" cried Mrs. Riley. The thought of having to take an elderly mother to his home made the man shudder. He, of course, tried to hide his displeasure, but a fleeting grimace did not escape Mrs. Riley's attentive gaze, hurt her loving heart. "You know, I have a buyer. Dr. Harvey is a very rich and influential surgeon," the son said. "He has always dreamed of moving to this neighbourhood so that he could live not far from his clinic. Well, you know, it's not just a piece of land, it's a dream. Of course, that's why we bought it in the first place. Your father and I thought you and your wife would move here so our grandchildren would have a place to grow up," Mrs. Riley said quietly. "But I don't have a wife and kids. Therefore, why do we need such a big place for the two of us? You said yourself you don't have enough money to maintain the house, so we'll find something not so huge." Simon frowned. "But I'm used to it here. I don't want to move in my old age." "Mum, you must get ready. Don't waste time," Simon said it firmly, changing his face. It was obvious that the son did not want to waste time on long persuasions. "You don't worry. I've already arranged everything. I'll take you to a place. I think you'll like it there," Simon said, giving out a wry smile. "To pack right now? Can we at least talk a little?" Mrs. Riley still couldn't believe what was happening, as if everything around him was just a prank. Simon looked at her, expressing with one gaze both impatience and unwillingness to deal with his old mother's whims. He simply went to the closet, took out the suitcase with which she had once travelled on business trips, and began to pack. "Sonny, well, where are we going to go? It's bad weather outside." But her son paid no attention to her entreaties. If, up to this point, Mrs. Riley had expected a little understanding, but now she realised that Simon would not change his decision. She would have to leave home, against her will, and go somewhere, and judging by the things he was packing in her suitcase, she would have to leave for a long time. "Don't forget the underwear," the woman said quietly. "Ah, yes, we'll take everything," waved Simon away. When he finished packing, the son placed his mother in his damaged car and started the engine. He hadn't been accustomed to taking care of his things since childhood, so his car appeared quite shabby. Driving out of the gate on the crunching gravel, the driver hurriedly left the place, wanting to get his mother away as quickly as possible, as if she could resist him. Meanwhile, the poor woman didn't know what to think. This was not the kind of treatment she had expected on her anniversary. "Where are we even going?" she muttered, gazing at the unfamiliar scenery. "Don't worry, you'll like that place," the son answered. A place? I wish you would tell me its name." "You'll see for yourself," muttered the son. Mrs. Riley let out a tired sigh and closed her eyes. She didn't realise when she began to doze off, lulled to sleep by the car's vibrations. It seemed they had been driving for at least a couple of hours before she was abruptly awakened by a sudden brake. "Oh!" the woman exclaimed, painfully hitting her knee on the dashboard. "I'm sorry," Simon replied, glancing indifferently at his mother. It seemed that his mother's condition bothered him much less than the deteriorating state of the car. Mrs. Riley looked around, bewildered. The surrounding countryside was completely unfamiliar. The woman wanted to question her son, but from his expression she realised that Simon was not wanting any conversation at all. She glanced around, but only saw an abandoned, dilapidated village, lost in the middle of nowhere. Time seemed to have forgotten this place, leaving behind reminders of its former grandeur. Old houses with cracked walls welcomed occasional travellers, their faded facades weathered like faces that had lost their youth. "Goodness, what is that?" Mrs. Riley sighed. "It's nothing. People still live here," Simon shrugged. "Are you joking?" "Well, not everyone has as much money as you," the son replied reproachfully. "I didn't get them out of nowhere. I've earned it all by myself. Now it's time. Oh well, never mind. Simon became irritated, abruptly ending their conversation. He carefully drove the car deep into the village, searching for the right house. The winding paths of the settlement had long been overgrown with grass, making their last effort to hold on to the abandoned land. Grasses and flowers bloomed boldly along the roadside, pushing their way through the ruins of the past. "Is there even phone reception here?" Mrs. Riley asked, shocked. "What do you need it for? You never use it anyway." "What if I need to call an ambulance?" "As if they would come here," Simon replied half-heartedly. "Oh, even the navigator doesn't work," the man muttered, poking his finger at the useless cell phone. They had to rely on withered signs to reach their destination. "Well, we're home," the son exhaled with a relief. Mrs. Riley looked out of the window, completely puzzled. They stopped outside a run-down shack, just as dilapidated as the rest of the neighborhood. "You need to stay here for a while until I sell the house. Then I'll find you a better place to live," the son said as he got out of the car. "How can I live here?" The mother shook her head in disbelief. Even in her distant childhood, the wooden house she was born in did not look so impoverished. Simon impatiently opened the passenger door, extending a hand to help her. There was no choice. Her son was determined to put her here. Mrs. Riley let out a heavy sigh and tried to get out, but a sharp pain shot through her bruised knee. She grimaced, attempting to soothe the joint, while her son literally dragged her out of the car. "Don't be grumpy, it's just an ordinary house. It's been vacant for a while. You'll spend here only a couple of weeks," Simon said. Mrs. Riley gasped in pain. She had no energy left to argue with her son. She obediently followed him, limping more with each step. "Well, come in," Simon muttered, unlocking the creaking door. The house was filled with a stale smell, and thick clouds of dust floated in the air. "In the suitcase you'll find everything you need. Clothes, medicine. I'll bring groceries later. There's actually a store nearby." "You took my card. And my money," Mrs. Riley whispered. "Oh, right. Then wait for me when I arrive." He placed the suitcase next to her, gave her the key, and walked back to the car without turning back. "Won't you stay with me for a while?" his mother shouted after him. "You settle in, I have things to do. I'll come for a visit on the weekend. Just wait." The son waved his hand. The engine roared and Simon drove off, disappearing into the blue cloud emitted from the exhaust pipe. An anniversary and a housewarming. So many celebrations in one day. Mrs. Riley grinned bitterly as she surveyed her new home. Her nose tickled with dust, her knee ached, and tears welled up in her eyes. In the morning, she could have not imagined that her beloved son's visit would turn out like this. But now... Grasping the handle of the suitcase, Mrs. Riley carefully stood up and slowly made her way to the nearest room. She didn't want to sit in the hallway until the weekend. The necessary documents for the sale of her house were quickly processed. Her son took care of all the hassle of selling the house, to spare his beloved mother any unnecessary trouble. She only had to adjust to life in a new place, which was not easy. As expected, Mrs. Riley couldn't sleep on the first night. The mattress on the creaky old bed was as hard as a rock. Old age was already hard enough to bear, and here was not even a hint of the comfort a pensioner needed. Could he really do this to his own mother? Mrs. Riley thought, tossing and turning. Later on, she learned from her neighbours that Simon had bought this dilapidated house from some swindler for a mere penny. Meanwhile, time went on. Simon, as promised, showed up on weekends with a few bags of cheap groceries, but never stayed for a visit. "Sorry, I can't stay, I have a lot to do," he quickly said, already heading towards the exit. "Well, at least have some tea," his mother said pitifully. "No time, I'll come back later." He waved her off. Several more weeks passed. During this time, her son didn't visit once, only sending her some money. Mrs. Riley gradually began to get used to her unfortunate situation, although her aching legs continued to bother her. The pain-relieving ointment she had brought from home was running out, and she didn't even know where her nearest centre of civilization was. Tea is running out too, Mrs. Riley sighed. This meant that she would have to make a trip to the store, which wasn't very far away, but with her sore leg and limp, the walk could take the entire day. Suddenly a strange noise came from the front door. The locked lock clicked as if a key had been turned. The rusty hinges creaked. Mrs. Riley froze on her stool, listening intently to what was happening. Thieves? No, they wouldn't use keys, would they? Maybe Simon returned, but his car would have been visible from the window. The woman trembled with fear as she heard confident footsteps, which, judging by the sound of creaking floorboards, were heading towards the kitchen. What's going on here? The man who entered exclaimed, looking around at the bewildered elderly woman. Hello, was all Mrs. Riley could manage to say. The first glance at the guest sent a chill down her spine and made her heart skip a beat. The guy appeared to be no older than 25, tall and thin. However, the sight of his tense muscle beneath the light windbreaker conveyed a sense of physical strength. His eyes were like burning coals that penetrated deep into her soul, carrying stories of cruelty and survival that were unfathomable. The grim yet intelligent expression on his face revealed that this young man had witnessed more than his fair share at such a young age. Mrs. Riley noticed the prison tattoos and became even more frightened, unable to comprehend how this man had ended up here. She was certain she had never seen him before. Are you attempting to steal anything here? A bitter grin played on his narrow lips. My son bought this house for me, Mrs. Riley said, gathering her courage. Really? So while I was in jail, somebody already resold my hovel? The stranger shook his head. In prison? Mrs. Riley asked. Yes, for 4 years. I kicked a big shot, and judging by such a big sentence, I must have left them crippled, an ominous voice replied. Oh my goodness, I haven't taken anything here. Everything is just as it is. I just tied it up a bit. Perhaps it was a mistake. I'll call my son. There's no cell phone reception here. The ex-con shook his head. Mrs. Riley fell silent, her head pulled back into her shoulders. She didn't know what to do in this situation. What could she, an old woman, do against a young and intimidating man? I'm sorry, Mrs. Riley said quietly. I have nowhere else to go. My house is far away, or rather it was. Could I at least wait in the garden on the chair for my son, while we figure out what to do? The stranger frowned at her with a stern gaze. Something in her words didn't please him, darkening his mood. Mrs. Riley was filled with fear, expecting the stranger to strike her on the head and be done with it. She even closed her eyes, but instead, she heard the man quietly sit down beside her. Don't be afraid. What kind of beast do you think I am, to throw you out on the street? A softened voice came. My name is Brian. Don't assume that just because I've been in prison, I'm necessarily a murderer. Mrs. Riley opened her eyes uncertainly, looking at her interlocutor. The guy tried to smile, soothingly raising his open palms. His face was actually pleasant, even handsome. Somehow he seemed accustomed to frowning most of the time, and had rarely radiated friendliness lately. Would you like some tea, then? Mrs. Riley asked cautiously. That would be great, he nodded. Unfortunately, I don't have much tea left. That's all right. I drove through town and bought some supplies. Brian gestured towards the backpack lying in the hallway. Mrs. Riley wanted to start cooking, but the guest, observing her difficulty in moving, Brian didn't allow her to fuss. He took matters into his own hands, putting an old kettle on the stove and preparing a simple dinner. It turned out that he was the previous owner of the house before he went to jail. And I ended up there accidentally, the guy said as he sliced sausage. Can you imagine? I stood up for a girl. I was walking down the street in the evening, and I saw 2 people harassing her, dragging her into their car. I stood up for the girl and beat them up. Who knew that among the children of rich parents there could be rapists?" "What a horror!" Mrs. Riley shook her head sincerely. "So you served time for something you didn't do? So many years of torment. And what about the girl? Didn't she testify in court?" "She disappeared somewhere. She must have run away out of fear. Well, the main thing is that she wasn't harmed." "I hope so. My fiancé, with whom I lived, only visited me twice. She slipped me a piece of paper to sign. Now I understand she sold the house. After that, she changed her address. In fact, I went to town to see her, not just for groceries." "So it's all illegal then?" Mrs. Riley exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "Of course it is. But if the case goes to court, they will believe her, not the ex-con. I've served 4 years, and there's no way to remove such a stigma," he replied. "I'm sure there's some help available." "You're a wonderful woman, Mrs. Riley. At your age, you still believe in fairy tales," he smiled. The evening crept up unnoticed. They finished dinner and then settled themselves comfortably in the living room. "By the way, I am an orphan," Brian continued the interrupted story, fixing up the TV. "From my early years, so to speak, I've been on my own. I didn't know my family, never saw my parents. Then I fell in love with Megan, my fiancée, who had sold this house." "I'm so sorry for you," said Mrs. Riley's head sadly. "I have a son, and I don't know what kind of person you'd have to be to give up your own little boy to an orphanage." "No offence, Mrs. Riley, but your son wasn't too worried when he sent you here." "Well, it's only temporary. Now he'll pay off his debts and then he'll find a better home." Brian furrowed his eyebrows incredulously but didn't argue. Why upset an elderly woman unnecessarily? It was clear to him that the good-for-nothing son would leave his mother to live out her life in a shanty village, forgotten by everyone. "Well, all right, if that's the case. But honestly, if I had at least one soulmate, I wouldn't abandon her and refuse to help her." "You'll see, he won't leave me either," Mrs. Riley sighed bitterly. The old TV showed streaks of colour and a muffled sound came from the hoarse speakers. Brian hummed contentedly, carefully putting the TV back. "Well, it's possible to live. Things will get better little by little," he smiled. "Frankly speaking, I don't know when Simon will come. I'll ask around the village. Maybe someone has a phone," said Mrs. Riley with a guilty expression. "Don't worry. Stay as long as you need. There's plenty of room. I'll sleep on the sofa. You sleep in the bedroom." So, they started to live together, the abandoned mother and the former convict. From the outside, one could think that the grandson came to visit his grandmother. The guy turned out to be handy and industrious, and he quickly cleaned up the yard that had been left unattended for 4 years. Brian got a job as a loader and slowly began to make repairs in the house. "Does it hurt much?" he asked once again when he saw Mrs. Riley rubbing her knee. "A little. If it weren't for you, it would have gotten worse," the woman replied. "We'll go to the doctor again tomorrow." "Oh, come on. I don't want to bother you." "It's decided. I'll order a cab and we won't have to push ourselves on the bus." "Don't argue. You won't change my mind, and if I need to," the guy said with a sinister face, "I'll drag you to the general practitioner by your hand." Mrs. Riley only smiled embarrassedly at the joke, thinking how lucky she was to have met him. He was always helping and caring, never once approaching her for invading his home. And everything would be all right. But the woman's health was getting worse every day. It was no longer just her knees. Apparently the stress of the last few months had shaken the body. "Well, Mrs. Riley, I have nothing to please you," said her doctor. "You know you can't improve anything at your age. If she needs medicine or procedures, just tell me, I'll get everything." Brian intervened. "Young man, unfortunately, procedures or pills for old age have not yet been invented." The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Brian sank into his chair. The words made him sad because, in the unexpected neighbour, he had finally found the family warmth he had never seen in his life. It even seemed that life began to get better. And now this. Rest, less stress, less strain, and many positive emotions, the doctor added, holding out a prescription for painkillers for the knee. Brian helped Mrs. Riley get ready, and taking her carefully under his arm, led her to the hospital exit. On the way they were silent, each thinking about their own thoughts. When they returned home, the man immediately put Mrs. Riley to bed, forbidding her to make a fuss about household chores. He took the doctor's advice too seriously, deciding to surround Mrs. Riley with as much care as possible. Brian was about to go to the store when suddenly he heard the sound of a motor right under the windows. The car honked a couple of times and then a frowning man got out. He had never seen Simon, but he immediately guessed who finally showed up to visit them. All this time, Mrs. Riley almost every day remembered her son, who did not send a penny for living. "Well, hello," greeted the uninvited guest glumly, stepping out onto the porch. "Who the hell are you?" Simon raised an eyebrow in surprise. "The owner of the house." "Ah, you must be the convict Megan used to date with," muttered Simon, recalling a long-ago conversation. "Don't you want to ask how your mother is doing?" he asked reproachfully. "None of your business." Simon wanted to go into the house, but Brian pushed him, causing him to almost somersault down the high steps. "Are you crazy? Do you want to go to prison again? I'll call the police right away." "Are you going to write a letter? The phones don't work here." "If I have to, I will." "Why don't you tell them about the real estate scam and about how you cheated the elderly mother without any remorse?" Brian said threateningly. "As if they care about old women." Simon frowned. He tried once more to go inside, but Brian pushed him away again, this time harder. Simon stumbled, struggling to keep his balance, grabbing the nearest post with his hand. Hearing the noise, Mrs. Riley went to the window and almost cried at her son's harsh words. "Simon, don't quarrel," she shouted, swinging open the glass casement. "Well, hello, Mum," immediately echoed the cowardly son. "Tell that to your watchman, better." "Are you here to pick me up? It's been months since the house was sold. Have you found anything?" "I haven't found anything yet," the man said briefly. When Brian heard this, he only hummed. Mrs. Riley felt her legs weakening. It appears that Brian was right. Her son apparently had no intention of taking her away from the village. "Why did you come, then?" said the mother in a drooping voice. "There's this thing. I wanted to ask for money. Well, a loan, of course. Work isn't going well until next month, and then everything will be back to normal," Simon said. "You took my card with my pension, and you've taken all my savings. What more do you want?" said Mrs. Riley, almost crying. "Maybe you've got some more money stashed away." "You're quite mad," Brian gasped at this insolence. The ex-convict had seen many scoundrels behind bars, but he had never encountered such a scum as Simon. So he had no further intention to talk to him any more. Brian moved menacingly toward him, lifted him by the collar, and threw him forcefully toward the gate. "I'll sue you!" shouted Simon, hastily picking himself up from the ground. "Go ahead, if your conscience allows it." Boiling with anger, Brian stepped towards the insolent man again, but Simon realized that he couldn't match the young man's strength, so he immediately ran to the car. The engine roared angrily, the exhaust pipe sneezed blue smoke, and Simon drove away. "I don't even want your spirit here anymore," shouted the furious Brian after him. Then he rushed into the house to check on Mrs. Riley's well-being. He was afraid that the son's behaviour would have an irreparable impact on his mother. But he found Mrs. Riley sitting on a stool. She looked sadly into the distance, holding back the tears that had accumulated in the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry, but sometimes I can't help myself. It's just like that time when those two tried to offend the girl." It's okay. You know, it's like my eyes have finally been opened to him. How did a funny little boy grow up to be like that?" "I don't know, Mrs. Riley. I guess you went wrong somewhere in your upbringing. The man shrugged. It might have been rude to say so, but he couldn't hide his attitude towards her son. Well, there was no upbringing at all sometimes. I worked to provide the best things for him, and I thought it would be enough, but I was wrong, and now I'm just dealing with it. Don't be sad. Everything will work out, he responded. You're a good man, though you've never seen affection in your life. You've been wronged by fate, but you grew up right. I was lucky to meet you in my old age. Please help me to my bed, or I'm getting a little uncomfortable. Brian immediately gave the older woman his hand. Mrs. Riley made herself comfortable and dozed off, while Brian went to the store, intending to cook something tasty for dinner to cheer her up. Several days had passed since Simon's arrival. Mrs. Riley had not been able to get out of bed, spending more and more time sleeping. The pills helped to relieve the pain in her knee, but her body was increasingly demanding rest. The worst was that Brian could not influence the situation, so he tried at least not to disturb the woman, providing the opportunity to spend the last days in peace and comfort. Brian, come to me, please, suddenly said Mrs. Riley in a weak voice, when he once again passed the bedroom. What's wrong? He asked worriedly. Nothing, smiled Mrs. Riley weakly. I have one request. There is a little thing that is critical to me. There's a shed in my former house at the very edge of the plot. I made a hiding place there as my heart felt it would come in handy. Simon sold the house, but I'm sure he didn't look in the shed. A single tear rolled down, making Mrs. Riley embarrassed by her own sentimentality. She wiped herself with her handkerchief, calmed down a little and continued. There's a little box lying there under the floorboards. Would you bring it to me? I'll be grateful for it forever. Mrs. Riley, don't worry. I'll deliver it in the best way, Brian promised, taking her hand. I'll go right now. Just tell me the address and the exact place where the box is. Not half an hour later, the young man was on the bus. The road took several hours because Simon took his elderly mother too far from the city. When he walked through the neighbourhood, his eyebrows rose at the sight of rich mansions. The young man had suspected before that Mrs. Riley was a wealthy woman before, but only now did he truly realise how much. And he's got a nerve, coming to her to demand more money. 1/10 of what he'd get for selling a house like that should last him several years, thought the ex-con. The shed was indeed in the place where Mrs. Riley had pointed out. It was a ramshackle structure on the boundary line between the plots. It had not been torn down because no one needed it, and it did not attract anyone's attention because it was hidden in the bushes. Brian cautiously looked around to see if anyone was watching. There were no passers-by around. There might not have been a better moment. The shed was unlocked, and he carefully slipped inside. The box was hidden at the very back of the building, under an inconspicuous doormat. Wow, a hiding place indeed, he whispered, scrutinizing the box nestled in the recess. Mrs. Riley's an ingenious woman. Why not rent a safe deposit box in a bank? The carved box was locked and quite heavy. He wondered what could be hiding in such a strange stash. He had originally assumed that the elderly woman kept letters or photos there, but judging by the weight, it was not paper. Brian took the box under his arm and was about to leave when suddenly he heard a persistent cough. I thought I was imagining things, said the man standing nearby the shed. A middle-aged man with a neat haircut and thin-rimmed glasses observed Brian with deep, scrutinizing eyes, as if deciding what to do with him next. Don't think I'm a thief, Brian said immediately, realizing how suspicious he must have seemed. Well, what would you call it then? Nodded the man, indicating the box in the ex-con's hands. Let me explain. I was sent by the former owner of the house, Mrs. Riley. She had something important here. She couldn't take it before she moved, so she asked me to bring it to her. That doesn't sound convincing so far. The man who sold me the house claimed that his mother had passed away long ago. That's not true. Simon, Mrs. Riley's son, moved her to a remote village. He sold the house to pay off his debts. Now she lives with me, but she's ill and old. I'm afraid this might be her last request." Dr. Harvey, the surgeon who had bought the house, looked doubtfully at the young man and contemplated whether to make the call or not to the police. Perhaps calling the on-duty squad should have been his first action. But Dr. Harvey was very curious about what the thief had been seeking behind in the old, unneeded shed. "Believe me, the last thing I want right now is trouble with the police. I wouldn't risk my freedom just to steal some obscure box." Brian shook his head. "I could have just brought Mrs. Riley here, but she's been feeling too ill lately. She can hardly get out of bed." "No need for that. I wouldn't recognize the former owner anyway. And any old lady could pretend to be the former owner," replied the surgeon. Brian sensed the man's hesitation about calling the police. He was about to make another attempt to convince him of his honesty when suddenly the front door of the mansion opened and a young girl appeared on the threshold. She exuded brightness and freshness, capturing everyone's attention. Her pleasant facial features seemed to create a magical harmony. Thick, silky auburn hair cascaded in waves across her shoulders. "Anna, please go inside. I'll be done soon," said Mr. Harvey. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" began the girl, but then her gaze fell upon Brian, and she froze, covering her mouth with her palm. "Hello? No more trouble?" Brian nodded, also recognizing in the surgeon's daughter the girl he had saved from the men. "Dad, it's him," muttered Anna. Her eyes welled up with tears as the events of that terrible evening flashed through her memory, causing her fragile shoulders to tremble once again. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" The girl rushed down the steps, heading confidently towards them. She was dressed in house slippers, a t-shirt and light shorts, brushing away the tears streaming down her cheeks. "My saviour!" she said, running up to Brian and embracing him. "I'm sorry I disappeared the other day. I didn't even get the chance to thank you. It was just so scary that I don't even remember how I made it home. It was all a blur." "It's all right. The main thing is that you were safe," smiled the young man, gently hugging her back. "And so," Dr. Harvey raised an eyebrow, "if I understand correctly—" "Yeah, Dad. He's the one who saved me from those ruffians in the back alley. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't shown up. By the way, what's your name?" "Brian," the young man introduced himself. "Thank you. If it weren't for you— Where did you go? I was searching for you," whispered Anna. "It's a long and unpleasant story," shrugged the uninvited guest. "Those thugs turned out to be the sons of wealthy parents. They accused me of attacking innocent men. 4 years in prison. I was only recently released. I met the former owner of this house and she sent me here." "I'm so sorry," said the girl with a trembling voice. "It turns out I owe you one," her father said. "I didn't even know how badly you were hurt after saving Anna. Honestly, if I had known, I would have definitely gotten you out." "Let's go inside. It's getting cold. At least we'll give the hero some tea," said the girl, taking Brian's hand. "I'd like to go home. Mrs. Riley is all alone there," Brian said, overwhelmed by the attention. "I'll drive you home later, don't worry. We must at least somehow thank you for everything." Dr. Harvey supported his daughter's initiative. They dragged the young man into the house, almost forcing him to join the dinner. Brian was a little shy, but he agreed to respect the hosts. He told of his misadventures, omitting the most unflattering moments, so as not to frighten the excited Anna. "What a horror!" whispered Anna, after listening to the whole story. "It happens. Sometimes even the closest people give you up, and sometimes complete strangers are willing to sacrifice their lives," nodded Dr. Harvey, looking at Brian. "What happened should not go unpunished. I will deal with Simon. There is a remedy for the likes of him." "I wish you would," said Brian, glancing at his watch. "I'm sorry, I was very glad to meet you, and if you like I'll drop in again sometime. But Mrs. Riley's all alone there now. I'm afraid to leave her for so long." "Of course. As promised, I'll give you a ride home," Dr. Harvey said, rising from the table. "Goodbye, my saviour," said Anna, hugging the guy goodbye. "Here's my phone number. Don't go missing again." "I won't," Brian promised, smiling. The men left the house, got into a fancy car and set off. Understanding the impatience and anxiety of the guy, Dr. Harvey tried to drive at the limit of permitted speeds. "Here is my house," Brian rejoiced when he saw a familiar hut with a faint light burning in the window. Apparently Mrs. Riley was waiting for his return, having switched on a small bedside lamp. "Would you like to meet her?" Brian asked. "Sure, I'll check her knee as a doctor as well," the man said. They got out of the car and went inside the house. The guest pensively looked at the poor decoration of the house, thinking about something of his own. Brian immediately hurried to the bedroom. "I think she's fallen asleep," he whispered, looking at Mrs. Riley, who had covered her eyes. The elderly woman was still in bed, half lying and half sitting on the pillows. In the fingers of her right hand, she was clutching a pen. Brian, trying not to make any noise, put the box he had taken from the stash on the bedside table and wanted to turn off the light. "Wait," said the surgeon quietly. He approached Mrs. Riley, leaned over her face, and then pressed his fingers to a point on her neck. "What are you doing?" Brian asked. "We've been late. She's gone." "What do you mean?" dazedly interrogated the young man, unwilling to accept the sad reality. "No pulse. No breathing either. She didn't seem to be in agony, it's just time," the guest said, shaking his head. "How could it be?" Brian said bitterly, settling down on a stool. He had been preparing for this day for a long time, but now that sadness had come into the house, he was completely confused. "Look, I think this letter is for you." Dr. Harvey stayed close by, realizing that the man needed support and distraction from his gloomy thoughts more than ever. "What?" Brian said it incomprehensibly. "A letter for you." The surgeon held out a yellowish sheet that lay on the nightstand under the lamp. With trembling hands, Brian accepted the note. "Dear Brian, I want to write you this letter to convey my deep, sincere feelings of love and gratitude. Every day spent with you was a true treasure that warmed my heart until the end. Words cannot express how proud and happy I am to have met such a wonderful person. I want to thank you for brightening my passing life with your presence and bringing so much joy and warmth to my aging heart. You were there for me when I needed support, helping me through a scary time, and I hope that I was able to show you, even just for a little while, what a family is. I want you to know that no matter where I am, my love will always be there for you. Never forget that you are a special and unique person, capable of bringing so much goodness. Don't let the weight of the past cloud your present, and please smile more often. I leave you my humble inheritance. The key to the box is on the table next to this letter. Open it and dispose of its contents as you see fit. With love and affection, your named Granny." The last lines echoed in Brian's mind. He couldn't hold back his tears and turned away, facing the wall. Dr. Harvey remained silent but stayed close, gently placing his hand on Brian's shoulder. He involuntarily became a participant in this very private moment, glad that he could support the young man during such a vulnerable time. They sat like that until Brian silently picked up a small key and inserted it into the keyhole of the box. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he managed to keep himself from bursting into sobs. The lock clicked softly and the carved lid folded open, revealing, despite his condition, Brian couldn't immediately believe his eyes. Inside the box there was a collection of gold, silver and precious stone jewellery. What he saw made him dizzy. "Why did she leave them to me? How could I accept such a thing?" Brian whispered. "It was her final will, made in her right mind and full memory. Don't doubt it. Mrs. Riley wanted you to have them, probably as a thank you for your selfless care. I wish I could trade all this wealth for her health, even just for a few more days." "Everybody's time comes, Brian. Don't hold on to her. Let her go to a better world. Continue with your life, having the memory of such a beautiful woman inside your soul." The man nodded, unable to find words to express himself. He was grateful that Dr. Harvey was there at such a moment. I think Mrs. Riley had been collecting these treasures her whole life, but she didn't trust her irresponsible son with them. You can handle them with dignity. Don't be afraid. It's a heartfelt gift. It would bring her joy to see them bring happiness to someone in need." Brian organised a lavish funeral ceremony, inviting neighbours and the few relatives he could find through Dr. Harvey's connections. The only person they didn't contact was Simon. Brian couldn't forgive him for his behaviour. After the funeral, all he cared about was the lost inheritance. He even tried to sue, but Dr. Harvey stood up for him and put Simon in his place. Now Simon was left, biting his elbows and harbouring resentment towards everyone around him. 2 years had passed. Brian visited the cemetery once a month to pay his respects and share updates on his life with Mrs. Riley. "I've started my own business, and your inheritance wasn't spent on entertainment," Brian finished his story, touching the cold stone of the gravestone. "I earn good money, and I'm a respectable groom, so to speak." "Well, how are you, dear?" Anna quietly approached. "Don't be sad. Mrs. Riley will always be in your heart." 2 years ago, upon learning of Brian's loss, Anna immediately decided to support him and help him through his grief. The young people became close during this time. They often talked, called each other, and then they did not notice how they began to date. Brian's life really changed for the better, and he was sincerely grateful to the kind-hearted Mrs. Riley, thanks to whom all of this was possible.